MYST didn't kill the point-and-click adventure genre, but it did take the blame. In 1980, Roberta Williams, one of the founders of Sierra Online, released Mystery House. It was the first graphic adventure game that used actual hand-drawn visuals. Before that, adventure games were just text on a screen. It was the first game to start veering away into what would become actual point-and-click adventures, cementing her legacy as queen of adventure games. And it paved the way for the golden age of adventure games led by Sierra and LucasArts, two companies with very different approaches to the genre. LucasArts brought us games like Maniac Mansion, Monkey Island, Sam & Max, and their philosophy was no dead ends and no unwinnable states. While Sierra brought us games like King's Quest and Space Quest, games that were more punishing and you could die, often just by exploring. These companies brought us games that were classics, they were commercial successes, and they spawned series that would go on for years. And the gameplay loop of these games was very simple. You'd get to a puzzle, get stuck, get frustrated until you figured it out, and then had this moment of achievement and success before you moved on to the next puzzle. They had rich worlds filled with interesting characters and strong writing. And with these games mainly being on PC, their target audiences were a little bit older. And then in 1993, we got MYST, developed by brothers Rand and Robin Miller at Cyan. A lot of people called MYST a point-and-click adventure, even though it didn't have a lot of the hallmarks of a point-and-click adventure. There were no characters, there was no dialogue, there were no inventory or items. It was just pure 3D rendered environments and puzzles. And with CD-ROMs becoming mainstream at the same time, it became the game that would showcase the technology. Many people credit MYST with the boom of CD-ROM drive sales. And that's because MYST sold over 6 million copies. If you include its sequels, it sold over 12 million copies. It was the best-selling game of all time for a decade before it got overthrown by The Sims. Now, some people contribute those numbers to the fact that MYST was often sold in bundles and in sales and even with some computers, but there's no real evidence that those gave any serious boost to its numbers. And its numbers weren't the only controversy because people didn't really know what genre to call MYST. People called it a point-and-click adventure game, but there was no inventory management, there was no NPC dialogue, there were no action buttons. You couldn't fail, you couldn't die, there wasn't even any punishment. It did have puzzles and the environment had a strong narrative, but it stripped away every mechanic that people thought of when they thought of point-and-click adventures. And gamers doing what gamers do, of course there was the argument that people that enjoyed MYST weren't real gamers, which is a conversation every time a casual game gets brought up. Playing shooter games like Quake make you a real hardcore gamer, while playing more casual games like MYST make you a casual gamer, a fake gamer, which is still discussions that happen to this day. And it's a question that gets asked anytime a casual game shows up and it shakes up the industry. Minecraft, Among Us, Animal Crossing. Anytime one of these casual games gets mainstream success, it's somehow seen as lesser than. Gatekeeping has always been an issue in video games. It was a problem then, and it's still a problem now. But seeing that MYST was such a huge success, developers did what developers always do. They wanted to copy it. So they copied the aesthetic, they copied the mechanics, and like most clones, they never really lived up to the original because they didn't have the heart, they didn't have the craft. They were just cheap imitations and they flooded the market. Black Dahlia, Dust, Starship Titanic. These games looked like MYST, but they didn't have the atmosphere, they didn't have the environment, they didn't have the feel, and they didn't do the numbers. And consumers recognized this, and so the whole MYST clone market started to collapse. At the same time, sales for traditional adventure games were also starting to fall. And a lot of people blamed the flooding of the market with all these MYST clones as the reason that traditional adventure games weren't selling as well. But the problem is, if no one was buying the MYST clones, why would that also mean no one would buy traditional adventure games? Because there was something else going on in the 90s. Doom, Half-Life, Duke Nukem, Command & Conquer, StarCraft. The audience for PC games was getting younger, and the interest was shifting. The genres were shifting. The market was shifting to shooters and real-time strategy games. Some players were looking for a faster paced, more action-oriented experience that a slower, more methodical point-and-click adventure game just couldn't provide. Real-time strategy games were taking off with multiplayer and LAN parties. The demographics were shifting to a younger audience that had different preferences. Adventure games were built for a different audience, and that audience didn't disappear, it just got overshadowed. And with the explosion of 3D animations and full motion video, games were becoming more expensive to make. And with a smaller audience, that meant adventure games like Gabriel Knight and Phantasmagoria had a smaller audience and a smaller return on a bigger budget, which scared investors, and so the investors went where the money was, which was real-time strategy and first-person shooters. And the explosion of the internet was another shot to point-and-click adventure games. Like I said, point-and-click adventure games had a very simple game loop. Get to a puzzle, get stuck, struggle until you figure it out, and then you get that sense of achievement. But online walkthroughs were becoming commonplace, and with an online walkthrough, you eliminate the struggle and the satisfaction. When any puzzle can be solved with a 10-second Google search, it cuts out the core of the genre's appeal. It became a core structural problem, and there was no design to get around it. Developers tried by making puzzles more obscure and ridiculous, but that only exacerbated the problem because it made players more likely to go look up answers if they couldn't figure it out. Over in Europe, they tried to combat the bloating budgets by flooding the market with cheap games. And by the late 90s, adventure games were synonymous with obtuse puzzles and cheap production values. Every publisher expected their game to be some MYST-size hit, instead of just reassessing what they were doing and looking at the new changing market. Even Sierra wasn't immune to the pressure to modernize and compete. And so Roberta Williams built a game specifically to chase MYST audiences, Phantasmagoria. It was a slow, atmospheric, story-driven game filled with full motion video and aimed specifically at non-traditional gamers. Critics even called it MYST with actors. And while Williams said she took that as a compliment, I'm not sure that wasn't just sarcasm. The queen of adventure games was trying to adapt to this new world that MYST helped create, just trying to keep the company she helped found alive. And unfortunately, when Sierra got sold, she walked away from games. The gaming world she helped create was gone, but not because of MYST, but because of what MYST's success had set in motion. And it kept her out of gaming for decades. The collapse of LucasArts and Sierra Studios were signs that the point-and-click adventure genre was dying off, but that was only in America. In the European market, point-and-click adventure games kept going well into the 2000s, and many were commercial successes because they managed to find their audience, which is exactly what Telltale did in America. Telltale proved that the genre had a future, it just had to change its business model. Games like Firewatch and What Remains of Edith Finch were good games that helped revitalize the genre, though some people just referred to them as walking simulators, which again goes back to the whole genre classification issue we had with MYST. And then some of the classics started getting revived. Monkey Island, Sam and Max, they were finding a new audience. The genre didn't die, just the AAA American version of it did. So what was MYST actually guilty of? It was a massive success in a way the industry couldn't understand. It proved there was a massive untapped audience for atmospheric, accessible games. And it gave a lot of publishers a very wrong idea of what audiences wanted. And a lot of publishers ended up trying to copy it without really understanding why it was so popular. But what MYST did not do, it did not kill LucasArts and Sierra. Bloated budgets and a shifting market did. It didn't drive away the real adventure game audience. They were just getting overshadowed by a larger market, the first-person shooter and real-time strategy markets. And it didn't create the clone problem. That was publishers trying to chase its success without understanding why it was a success. MYST was a catalyst and it was a scapegoat, but it was not the cause. It just revealed that the traditional adventure game market wasn't as big as developers always thought it was. It exposed the genre's design weakness by making something that was more accessible to more people. And then it got the blame when publishers made horrible decisions trying to chase its success. The story of MYST isn't about one game ruining a genre. It's about an industry that saw something it didn't understand, panicked, and made a series of terrible decisions trying to chase after money. When that failed, they needed someone to blame. See you next time.